In this video, I want to, I actually already spoke with this person by phone, but I want to go over some questions that she had regarding new moon, because I think answering them is going to be of benefit to you. So she said, I listened to a few of your new moon videos today, and I have a few questions. The first main question is how to reconcile my understanding of the creation week with the new moon being the first visible crescent. Okay, so she's looking at Genesis, the creation week, with the new moon being the first visible crescent. Either my understanding of the creation week needs tweaking, or my understanding of the new moon, or both. It seems like in Genesis 1:1, the first thing God creates is the heaven and earth, although maybe this act does not constitute a day because there was no light and darkness to denote the passage of time from the perspective of earth. Then he moves on to create light and separate it from darkness. The light had to come from somewhere, so maybe he began making the sun and maybe the moon on the first day along with the formless earth, and the sun was giving off some sort of light before they had been completed on the fourth day. Could the different Hebrew words for create have different connotations? Asa versus bara in verses 1 and 16. To appoint, advance upon versus to make from scratch. Those are good questions. I'm glad that she's, doing her due diligence to look at the original words and the translations. Obviously, God can do whatever he wants with his creation, and so the moon could have been created in entirety on the fourth day, but then I'm confused. So this is the culmination of her question, because I know it sounded a little bit confusing to me. That's why I called her. She said, obviously, God can do whatever he wants with his creation, and so the moon could have been created in entirety on the fourth day, but then I'm confused that the new moon was created on day 4, and then 3 days later was Sabbath. Okay, so that right there is going to be the main point that we need to focus on. So she is defining or understanding that God has defined Sabbath in Genesis, but he didn't do that. So let me finish reading the message, and then we'll talk about that. Or maybe he didn't create the moon to be in its first visible crescent on the fourth day of creation, so it wasn't technically a new moon, just when the moon was born new. Wouldn't it make sense that if God starts the first week of his month with a new moon, that the very first week of the very first month would be started with a new moon? Yeah, it does make sense. I completely understand that. She says, can you tell that I'm confused? Well, I can tell that she's sorting through all of the pieces and that she's really diligently studying. So, after getting on the phone with her, what I realized is that she was reading Genesis, doing her due diligence to understand where does all of this come from, and that realizing that God on the seventh day rested. But see, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You understand? So the Sabbath, for that to be a Sabbath, God is not entering his own rest. It just simply says that he rested. It's not until Exodus that God says, I'm going to test this people. I'm going to test the Israelites. That's what he said to Moses. And so he does this test with the manna. You're going to go out, you're going to collect the manna, and you're only going to take enough for the day, except on the sixth day, when you're going to collect double, because the seventh day you're going to observe a Sabbath. That's the first place where and obviously this is the seventh day. It's hearkening back to him resting on the seventh day. But it doesn't mean that the first seventh day was a Sabbath. God wasn't entering his own rest. God is God. We need to enter his rest, right? We need to enter his rest and be restored by his spirit of peace and rest in his sovereignty and withhold from our flesh and check our flesh, making sure that we're circumcised, to check our hearts really, to make sure that our hearts are circumcised from the flesh. That's not something God is doing. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So this answers the first question. God created within this within this week, but that was not the first new month. Okay, new moon is just translated. The translation is new month. That's what new moon is. It's a new month. Now, where did God establish his calendar? He established his calendar in Exodus as well. So the Sabbath was established when the Israelites were in the wilderness. That's when he established his Sabbath. His calendar was also established in Exodus, but it was prior to the Israelites leaving Egypt. They hadn't been in the wilderness yet. And God said, this is the first month of your year, the month of Aviv, or Nisan. They're used interchangeably. Okay, so this is where he established this. In Genesis, he's just showing us what he did within a week. But he's just demonstrating what was going on during creation. It's not until Exodus that he then starts defining his calendar and his sabbaths. And then there's this understanding. One of the things that that was challenging for me when I was learning about new moon is that there's a lot that you have to deduce from new moon. Like, whereas with Sabbaths, you have like Leviticus 23 talking about, 6 days of work and a seventh day of rest. Numbers talking about the sacrifices that are brought. So there are clear instructions, whereas with new moon, you've got to pull from Amos, which is telling you that, the people are in a hurry to get back to work on new moon and Sabbath, so it's understood that these are rest days. You also have new moon translating to new month, and so then you understand, new moon is the first day of the month. So there's a lot in scripture that has to be deduced regarding new moon, but it's so important. Like, you can't even observe Sabbath correctly unless you've been observing new moon. You can't observe the holy days correctly unless you've been observing new moon. So that's it. So we know when God's calendar starts. It started in Exodus. We know when the Sabbath started. Up until that point, there was no established Sabbath. There was no established calendar. And so if there was no established calendar, then we can kind of understand that there was no new moon observance until that time. At least scripture does not indicate that there was. And if all of these things were suddenly being instituted and God was saying these are the things you are to observe, new moon would have gone along with that. Now let's test it to see where the first mention of new moon is. Well, there you go. Numbers 10:10. At your times of rejoicing, your appointed festivals and new moon feasts, you are to sound the trumpets over your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, and they will be a memorial for you before your God. I am the Lord your God. So there you go. He set apart his people, then told them what they were to do. This is where he instituted his festivals. This is where he instituted his Sabbaths. Was, in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Why would new moon be any different? Okay, please discern this with God.